those of us who know something about religion will be aware of things like, it's very often the case that people don't particularly care whether their beliefs are true or even necessarily what they believe. I find this all of the time as a professor. It's very common to kind of ask people very basic things about the things that they believe, religious or otherwise. And, very often you get this response, well, I've never thought of it that way, or this is just what I'm told is true by some source of authority, right? So to even frame things in terms of belief, I feel is quite problematic from a humanities scholar perspective. Very often you'll hear climatologists talk about the problem of the climate crisis as being precisely one of belief. If we can just get everyone to believe the correct thoughts, then we'll be saved, much as a Protestant is saved by having the correct thoughts about Jesus,
Yeah. So anyway, Tad, it's a pleasure to have you here. Let me introduce you properly. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is philosopher, religion scholar, and interdisciplinary critical theorist Tad DeLay, PhD. Tad is a philosophy professor in Baltimore and the author of several books that I'll mention briefly, and then we're going to talk about one. What does the white evangelical want? The Cynic and the Fool, God is Unconscious. And the book we're talking about today is Future of Denial, the Ideologies of Climate Change. And let's see, please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts. That's me. And to my Substack commentary, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And if you do go to the Substack, or to watch this on YouTube, please subscribe by punching the subscribe button or tapping it or whatever you do to subscribe, because that's a way to support us. So, Tad, let me say, I finished reading the book this morning, and I have a lot of questions for you, and I also have to let my dog out. Just wait a second here.
No problem.
Sorry, Jeannie just came back. Jeannie's my wife. She just came back from her exercise class, and Zip, my dog, does not want to not be in the same room with my wife, Jeannie. She's a favorite person and he's a favorite person. So that's the reality here. So anyway,
Right.
let me introduce you again properly here in terms of this book. The book I've just completed reading is your new one, Future of Denial, the Ideologies of Climate Change. And I have some quotes. I read it on Kindle, so I pulled the quotes out, and I'll be reading some things to bring up various topics of discussion with you. And I'm going to just start by, these are not in order where they appeared. I guess this is from page 38 or something. Of what am I trying to warn? ? Capitalism's carbon dependency creates denial in the form of pseudo-solutions, gimmicks, false promises, and quotidian violence, much like repression leads to asymptomatic return of the repressed. And you have another statement that I want to quote here from a little later in the book, just to set this up. My thesis isn't complex. Climate denial should be a flexible term designating a broad range of activity. I am not cleverly twisting a new definition. We find it intuitive to say teenage recklessness expresses a belief in invincibility, denial of mortality. Troubling symptoms are ignored or explained away by a patient in denial about what a physician might diagnose. Expensive purchases or self-sabotage during a midlife crisis are denials of fading time or unsatisfied desire. We commonly speak of denial as behavioral, but for climate change, we reflexively confine ourselves to a narrow meaning of denial focused on conscious belief. So I want you to sort of take off from those 2 points, and I've read the book, and I'm going to be quoting your own book back to you to get our discussion going. But let's just pretend we're having a cup of coffee and met 5 minutes ago, and you're telling me about this book. I've kind of laid out a little bit of the thesis. Describe the book as you would describe it to someone, thumbnail sketch it, so we can get into the content without having to sort of explain everything.
Yes, sure. Yeah, as if we just met 5 minutes ago, which is kind of an interesting jumping off point because I believe I mentioned over email. I think when I was working my way out of the sort of evangelical fundamentalist upbringing that I had, I knew your father's name, and then I followed some of your writing here and there, I believe, and found it quite helpful at that particular phase in my
Yeah.
life. But of course, those of us who know something about religion will be aware of things like, it's very often the case that people don't particularly care whether their beliefs are true or even necessarily what they believe. I find this all of the time as a professor. It's very common to kind of ask people very basic things about the things that they believe, religious or otherwise. And, very often you get this response, well, I've never thought of it that way, or this is just what I'm told is true by some source of authority, right? So to even frame things in terms of belief, I feel is quite problematic from a humanities scholar perspective. Very often, you'll hear climatologists talk about the problem of the climate crisis as being precisely one of belief. If we can just get everyone to believe the correct thoughts, then we'll be
Hmm.
saved, much as a Protestant is saved by having the correct thoughts about Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I want to argue that actually, kind of denial is much more ramified and enacted than that, and can even express itself through pseudo solutions or gimmicks or violence, right? And
Mm.
so what I wanted to kind of explore in this book is the way in which, okay, yes, it is the case that, well, for at least a while, there was growing public acceptance of the reality of anthropogenic climate change, right? Human-caused climate change. We have some recent evidence that suggests that this is actually going backwards a little bit.
Mm.
Belief in climate change has actually dropped among American liberals by about from 72% to 60% in the last 5 or 6 years, which is interesting, right? It was this idea that you can only go up, right?
Right.
And that actually, as more and more people became aware of the science and saw the effects with their own eyes, right, that it would become
Mm.
undeniable. I mean, just for a bit of perspective, right? The last ice age was 4 or 5 degrees Celsius colder than it is right
Yeah.
now. And we've already done one and a half, about 1.3 degrees of warming so far.
Mm.
Probably we're on the order of, depending on, range of projections, 3 to 5 degrees by end of century. So that means we've done already about a third of an ice age change, just in the opposite direction. And we did that mostly in the last 30 years, and that doesn't seem to be enough to drive widespread acceptance. But even if we did have 100% acceptance, our situation is far more complex than that. Four-fifths of our energy inputs come from fossil fuels. We don't have the ability to rapidly decarbonize, not at that
Yeah.
scale, in the time necessary, right? Without planned economies and a sort of global revolution in the way that we
Yeah.
organize ourselves, right? And so, what does this look like in practice? Well, so in my book, I draw, for example, on how human beings responded to plague back in the day, right?
Hmm.
When people are faced with the catastrophic loss of everything around them, and a third of Europe is burning off in a few years, how do people respond? Well, some cities pioneer public health, right? But other places just ignore it, right? Some
Yeah.
people try to stay secluded from others. Other people, it's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Some people try to mitigate it through
Mhm.
smelling apples to ward off the bad air, which is supposedly causing plague, right? And what we need to kind of encounter is that people can be dropping dead from this, experiencing it themselves and not be
Yeah.
aware of it. Only about half of Americans say that they've experienced global warming's effects already, even though
Yeah.
100% of people in the entire world have, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
From the hotter summers and polar vortexes to the cost of your food and clothes when cotton yields and staples drop 10% for every degree warming, right? So I
Yeah.
wanted to think about how it's much more ramified, much more complex, and enacted in
Mm.
things like carbon offsets and so forth.
Yeah. One thing I really enjoyed in your book, and you just alluded to that, was your kind of historical references. I was very drawn into the book. And by the way, I would love to tell everybody up front that this is a really good book, and we're going to include it in our book club, which we call It Has to Be Read. It's kind of a takeoff on my commentary, It Has to Be Said. So I think I'm going to put it in November.
Wonderful.
Um, it's a good book and really important. And what I was interested in terms of just the book itself, two couple of things. First of all, you write really well, and that will be
Thank you.
evident when I
Thank you.
read some passages out loud here. People will see you're a writer. You have a kind of a mordant sense of humor, or not. Perhaps humor is the right word, but you certainly, drawing parallels between the plague and our present condition, greenwashing, the hypocrisy. Something that would be unexpected, I think, from conservative friends of ours would be the fact that you lay the climate denial both at the doors of the left and the right. And of course, the hinge between the two, the bridge between the two, is a basic denial of climate change when it comes to asking us to change lifestyle or basic economic systems. So the left comes up with electric cars or wind farms, and the right denies everything. But what neither will do is look at everything on the table and say maybe we've got to rethink everything. So the book is big that way. Another thing that is interesting to me, besides the commentary aspects of the book, is the science. And I'm not a scientist, but I could see that you had really done your homework and that you have a good sense of climate science. I've read some climate science books by people who do know what they're talking about in their field. This is all they do. And I think your references to climate science, the graphs, the charts, the illustrations you have are really important because they ground your overview commentary. So I would say with the historical tie-in, the history lessons you teach, the climate science basics that you got in the book, borne out by references and footnotes and all the rest of that, plus your analysis, which I think is really the heart of your book, of why this is and how it roots back into human psychology, theology, and our history as a species, more than just any particular part of our history. I really think it's brilliant. I've never seen all these things combined in one book before. There are aspects in other people's work, but you've really done something unique and really important. So I really think this book
Well,
is important.
yes, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I appreciate as well just the comment on the writing style. That's something
Yeah,
I try to put a lot of work into getting the words right and making it, if not a happy read, then at least an engaging and enthralling
it's a
read. And so
very
I
engaging read.
appreciate that. Yes.
Yeah, and has
Yes,
wonderful
no, and
unexpected twists. Yeah,
yeah,
go
well,
ahead.
and I was, I've always loved earth sciences and physics ever since high school. I think I got into the humanities because I had some religious and philosophical questions I needed to
Yeah,
work out. But had I not, perhaps I would have gone into a STEM field. I'm quite happy with how things turned out, but I don't have formal training in climatology. And my sense kind of early on was that I would either have to rely on climate journalism, right? And which kind of, it can be kind of hit or miss. Sometimes it paints vividly
yeah,
worst case scenarios, and then climatologists kind of stepping in saying, okay, we don't think those things are going to get quite that bad. Or I would have to learn the science. And I had this moment where I was kind of wondering how hot could it be if we just burned up all of our fossil fuels, and what's their dollar amount? Because obviously their
yeah,
dollar
yeah.
amount matters, right? And I can't seem to find a good number on that. And I'm also looking around, how hot would it be if we just burned through them? And I would read one climatologist saying 9 degrees Celsius, another would say
Mhm.
20 degrees Celsius, another would say 18 degrees, but not
I think you
specify
came up with
Fahrenheit.
10 at one point. You came to 10, and you'd said then it would be like Saudi Arabia, and we'd all have to just move indoors.
Right, right. Yeah, well, I mean, my thinking was, we have data on how much volume we think in the ground is.
Yeah,
We have the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has coefficients for how much a carbon dioxide pulse would turn up the temperature, and then
yeah,
we have going market rates that tell us what the value is. So I thought, I'm not going to find the answer in one place, right? But I can
yeah,
draw from the energy and from International Energy Agency on the one hand, the IPCC on another, market rates for fossil fuels, and I can combine these and say, okay, if we burn through all of our reserves, we would turn temperature up another 1.5 degrees from where it is now.
yeah,
But if we burn through the entire broader fossil fuel resources that we have in the ground, much of which we can't get to, but a good
yeah,
portion of which we can, then it's more like 20 degrees Celsius,
yeah,
and Earth could sustain maybe a few million people in Antarctica if they were lucky enough to grow food in hell. But yeah, so I mean, it's a vast number. And I wanted to really get people a way to understand this, right? Because my
yeah.
sense is that much as people are aware that greenhouse gases are connected to warming of the planet, nobody
Mm,
really knows how that works, right? And so I wanted
yeah,
to explain, okay, so the sun hits us with the same radiation spectrum that it always has, but we are no longer radiating out all of that energy. And this is really basic physics. I'm going to just kind of
yeah,
draw just
yeah.
and maybe just to kind of give your audience a taste for the way I'm approaching the science. The basic problem is Earth energy imbalance. The sun, an object that receives energy, must radiate out that exact same amount of energy in order to maintain energy equilibrium and therefore
Yeah.
heat in equilibrium. If an object receives energy but emits more, it gets colder because of a net loss of energy. If an
Mm,
object receives energy and emits less, then it's holding in energy and getting warmer. That's what we're doing, because while the sun hits us with broad spectrum radiation, the greenhouse gases trap a small amount of that energy, less than half of 1%. and it accumulates at the rate of 1.3 watts per square meter.
Mm.
However, multiplied across all of 510 million square kilometers of Earth's surface, that energy imbalance is the equivalent to more than 900,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs worth of energy held in our Earth system every single day, or
Mm.
about 330 million atomic bombs worth of energy every year, right? More than
Mm.
90% of that energy goes into the ocean, where it will continue raising the sea level for hundreds of thousands of years. Or at least tens of thousands of years, hundreds if we kept the warming up kind of indefinitely, right?
Mm. You set it up in a couple of ways at the beginning. You say, my goal is to map out recurrent patterns of denial expressed as government policy, corporate greenwashing, and military or border violence. And we're going to revisit the military and border violence topic
Yes.
because you played that out very thoroughly in your book in terms of how this pattern of warming is going to deprive us of a livable planet, but at the same time create incredible conflict between humans. And
Yes.
you
Yes.
picture this, you picture the elites sort of hunkering down in their bunkers somewhere, the rest of us left to deal with hordes of people who are now being displaced by climate. And for those reasons, you say the age of denial is over, or so we are regularly told. With each new climate report, protest, and catastrophe, we hear, quote, the age of denial is over, often in that precise phrasing. And then you say, today's reactionaries are increasingly ethno-nationalists, and rather than acknowledge the fires they see with their own eyes, will instead dial up violence. So let's go there for a minute because I find what you were saying, that is not said very much. You have climate denial leads to violence. So unpack that a little bit because you make a really good argument in your book for this, and you bear it out with examples from history, how
Mhm.
this plays out. But I don't think it's something people understand is on the way. And of course, in the context of this election coming up, when one of our major themes of the election coming from Trump and the MAGA people is how do we shut our border?
Mhm.
And if necessary, who was it you were saying, the Israelis or the Saudis or someone patrolling their borders already with drones
Yes,
to
yeah.
to
Israel has
to
used armed sentry drones at the edge of Gaza for years, and during the current genocide, they're flying little quadcopters in to. I mean, there was one report, for example, that quadcopters were being flown in and sending out wailing to sort of mimic an infant crying in distress, and if someone comes out, the drone will shoot the civilian
yeah,
that comes out to assist, right?
yeah. And so we
So what?
already have
So
we
when
already
we
have
talk about these technologies are out there
the
and
technologies
battle
are out there,
proven.
and I think it's the Saudis who have had their troops gunning people down coming over one of their borders already,
Hmm.
which is kind of ironic since Saudi Arabia pumps a lot of oil and fits your story here. But talk about the correlation between climate change denialism, not just the change itself, but how the denialism affects world history, as it were, and then besides the fact that we heat the planet up and make it unlivable, we unleash cycles of violence of human on human in reaction to what happens that is happening because we've denied it. So it's a sort of a step process. But I found the writing about the violence and the conflict part of it and the military response part of it something that isn't usually part of the discussion. So please
Yes,
take us there.
absolutely.
It's a
Yes, yeah,
very
and we should
original part of
know.
your book.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I began the book with this story of Portland wildfires in 2020. Some of your listeners may remember these vivid
Yeah.
images of the sky turned orange or even
And
blood
you're
red
not
at
from
noon.
around here. You're not
Yes,
from around
yes.
here.
So the story goes that there were these armed checkpoints that were springing up independently from these little militias around Portland, an overwhelmingly white area of the Pacific Northwest. And they were slowing down evacuees on the road trying to get out. And what that actually meant was you had these armed militiamen ended up pointing weapons at reporters and families. The opening story is that a gunman pointing a weapon at an African American mother with children in the back of her van. And what are they doing? They're working off malicious social media rumors that Antifa was, jumping into the forest and lighting these wildfires, right? And so, seeing the effects of climate change with your own eyes doesn't mean that people say, "Oh my God, this is climate change." They say, "Oh my God, this must be an outside agitator," right?
Yeah.
And there's a really wonderful book by Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective called White Skin, Black Fuel that identifies this pattern that in European far-right parties, where it's much more common to talk openly about anthropogenic climate change, one pattern that we see is that when a far-right figure makes a statement acknowledging climate change, they will use it immediately to make a statement about curtailing migration, right?
Mm.
So we need to think about the exchanges, the pressures building up in a way that can kind of fuel into ethno-nationalism. But
Yeah.
also, if we're talking military tech, if you plot out, I discussed at one point, if you plot out a map of drone strikes, what you would find is that they basically all hit zones that are right on the aridity line, winding
I
through the
found that very
Sahel. And
interesting, by the way. That
right,
jumped right
yes,
off the
and so
page.
yeah, so the aridity line for those are it's where there's just enough rainfall to
Yeah.
be able to grow crops, right? So you have a lot of cities on those, but they're also stressed, right? They're food stressed and water stressed, which means they have a lot of strife in those communities, and those end up being the people that Western governments label terrorists and hitting
Yeah.
with airstrikes. So meanwhile, we're talking about the water wars as if they're a decade or two away. You are already engaged, right? Our tax
Yeah. We're
dollars are
watching them
already
right
engaged
now.
in
Yeah.
the water wars. We are killing people that we call terrorists, that that Western governments perceive as terrorism, but that are fighting to survive and food stressed and doing what they can, right? And also just kind of pulling back. I mean, we need to think about how AI will integrate, how new military systems are increasingly trying to get distance between the operator that has to push a button and the person that dies, right? So there
Yeah.
can be an intervening system that makes kill decisions on its own, which could be funneled into automated, kill bot systems. None of this is Terminator stuff, right? Again, these are all systems that are out there in the world and marketed as battle
Yeah.
proven in the world's favorite testing ground, which is Gaza, right? That once something is used in Gaza, it gets to be marketed as battle proven.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, and just to not put too much of a point on it, but Israel is a really interesting test case here for what we mean by the connection between fossil fuels and military violence, right?
Mm.
Because Palestine was first invaded by the British with steamships, right? That was basically their first test run of operational steamships, as the assault on Akko and Beirut and the rest of Palestine in the 1840s. Much of that was being done because Egypt was expanding and displacing the British market for textiles, right? In other words, Britain was industrializing. They were
Mm.
producing new textiles with these coal-fired, machinery, right? And Egypt was also building their own machinery powered on
Mm.
coal, and they were being able to carry out some sort of competition that was sort of fraying, regional control with the Ottoman Empire and so forth. And so to maybe speed forth a little bit, America's kind of taken Britain's place as the global empire, right?
Yeah.
But starting in the 1960s, oil became the outpaced coal as the chief energy input in the
Mm.
world, right? So after the 1960s, right, you start to get into the 70s, you get the oil crises, the energy shocks,
Yeah.
right? And ever after, Israel is the beneficiary of all the supposedly $4 or $5 billion a year, but in a crisis, as we've seen recently, almost unlimited military aid, right?
Yeah.
And all of that is done still to sort of tamp down Arab self-assertion over fossil fuels, right? And so it is very interesting that the place in the world that tests these systems is also tied to a type of conflict. And, perhaps by the time listeners are, hearing this, we'll be at war with Iran for all of we know, right? Which again will be an entirely about control of the region and fossil fuel
Sure.
resources, right? And so, yeah, so
Yeah. If you
all of these
took,
things are tied
if
together,
you
right?
roll history back, and just to make sure your point's clear, if you kind of reverse this, and the whole part of the world you were talking about was resource poor Switzerland with some mountains and glaciers for hydropower, but no oil, it would be unimaginable to project a situation in which there would be an ongoing conflict like this with oil out of the picture. It's
Hmm.
not. We define the Middle
Yeah.
East by Islamic versus Jewish and history and so forth and so on. And you're saying no, it's defined by the fact that sitting under the ground is this enormous reserve of oil, which we find useful. And if tomorrow morning it was gone or it had never been there, you would have an entirely different human history on the ground there.
Absolutely. And Israel would continue to play that role as sort of a client state until the US decarbonizes, at which point it
Yeah,
won't need it, right?
yeah,
This is part of the threat of renewable resources, right? There's not a lot of military arms weapons that can be kind of justified if,
yeah,
some place in the world is getting all of the power through hydro and wind.
yeah.
Right. And so what climate change is resonating with in terms of the military industrial complex, of course, in the case of Israel, is also evangelical apocalypticism, right?
Yeah,
So you
which
have a
you're,
much
and I just want to
older
go back
story, right?
and talk about your books because I just want to remind you who Tad is. And he's written against colon, what does the white evangelical want? And Tad and I both come from a similar kind of a background, or we share a kind of a knowledge about that. And I write a lot about Christian nationalism and I make commentaries on it,
Hmm.
try to explain things like who Opus Dei are and why Project 2025 folds this, Roman Catholic tradition in and so on. So we have a lot of overlap there. But let's take a minute, since you brought up the topic of Israel, to talk about foreign policy in America, in this instance, not being shaped by the Jewish population as much as something that gets far less press, and that is a white evangelical apocalyptic vision that is, in essence, anti-Semitic itself, because it presupposes that the Jews somehow will all be lost or killed when Jesus comes back anyway, but is interested in the state of Israel for
Right.
an entirely off the chart reason, unrelated to oil. I'd be interested in your own theory, even though it's not the topic of your book specifically, on how those two things merge. There's the oil
Yeah,
here,
yeah.
which is why we're really there. And then you have this substrata of the population like Reverend Hagee or wherever down in Houston, who built an entire megachurch around Israel as a nation state that is needed in order for Jesus to come back. These
Yes.
don't seem like they belong on the same page, but if anybody's done the thinking, you have. Take us there.
Yeah, two quick resources. In my book, Against What Does the White Evangelical Want? The whole first chapter is on apocalypticism, where I categorize all the extant data on how many Americans don't believe that there will be a future,
Right.
and kind of ask what the connection is between that and climate change. Second
Well, and
resource
and
for
in this
anyone.
current book, you say they don't believe there'll be a next century.
Right. Yeah. 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 And to the put a just I just put released an article in Parapraxis magazine, which anybody can find online for free if you want to read like a little bit of taste of this thinking.
Yeah.
The article title is Evangelical Zionism, so you can look that.
Right.
But I detail the Christian Zionism is actually several hundred years older than Jewish Zionism. Jewish Zionism emerges
Sure.
prominently with Theodor Herzl at the end of the 19th century.
Yeah.
But going back to the Reformation period, you start to find, especially in Calvinist circles,
Yeah.
iterations of this idea that Israel will have to be reestablished. There gets to be a lot
Yeah.
of weird race thinking and questions about mixing white and Jewish heritage and all of that. How will God know and so forth, right? But you start to find, so with the Geneva Bible in the 1500s, right? You start to
Yeah.
find like footnotes saying Israel is going to be reestablished, and
Yeah.
and this is explained, of course, most famously in the Scofield Reference Bible at the early 20th century, which is
Sure.
the Bible that introduces people to this dispensational reading where there's a rapture and all of that. To kind of summarize this problem in brief, depending on how what the poll is and how you word the question, something like 1/5 to 1/3 of Americans don't believe that there will be a future because God will come back sometime this century. Among white
Yeah.
evangelicals, it's about 2/3, right? And so this type of belief is kind of something that resonates, I think, in the background
Well, then you
because
quote
while
somebody saying, "Why should we fix this since Jesus is coming back anyway?" I mean, that's in your
right,
book.
yeah, yeah. At one point, I had a pastor kind of directly tell me, like, even
Yeah,
if we
you
believe
quote
in the
that in your
climate
book.
scientists, why
Yeah.
should we care? And right, and the answer is correct. Like, if this dispensational reading is correct, then there is no logical reason to care about the climate crisis, right? All of this
Right.
has been foretold, and God has promised to destroy, right? Who was it? I think it was Hal Lindsey once
Yeah.
talked about the tribulation as being what he called the mother of all Holocaust, and he meant that
Yeah.
in kind of an exciting way, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the anti-Semitism is right there on the surface, right? And then after the Antichrist, kills all of the Jews alive, right? What does God do? Well, except for 144,000 of them,
Yeah.
all the Jews go to hell, right? So the Christian Zionist vision is one in which Jews are destroyed, right?
Yeah.
All but 144,000, which if you do the math in a world with a little over 15 million Jews, that means less than 1% of Jews
Yeah.
are saved, and 99% plus are damned, right?
Well, and by the way,
And
just
so, yeah,
to footnote this, I grew up on this theology in the sense that the
as did
return
I,
of
yeah.
Israel was one of the proofs that we're right, because since 48, they were there. And if you look at the history of the Balfour Declaration, yep, these were evangelical Christians in the United Kingdom who also had this same idea. And so it's Protestant evangelical post-reformational theology coming out of Calvin's Geneva Bible ties in with a thread of history that
Hmm.
most people's eyes glaze over if you try to explain it to them, as you've just explained.
Yes,
But
yeah.
fast forward to the present, and all of a sudden it's AI directed weapon systems defending oil interests somehow converge with the most off the chart thing you could come up with. One more thing, and then I'll shut up, which ties in beautifully to your historical examples, because are we any more sane and rational than people were in the Middle Ages when they were smelling an apple to get rid of the plague? Nope, we're still there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Evolution has not had time enough to improve our cognitive
Not at
capacities
all.
from a few hundred years ago. Right. And so
No.
anything that would have happened back then is something that we would still do now. Right.
Yep.
We are evolutionarily basically the same as we were when we first got out of the cave and started
Yeah.
figuring out agriculture. Right. And so any type of sort of reaction against the other that we've seen in the past, we should expect to see more of. It will be worded differently. It will be coded with different cultural signifiers, but
Yeah.
all of those, lashing out, the desire to harm somebody because one does not want to admit that one is not in control of one's world,
Mm-hmm.
those will all return. Yes, yeah, absolutely.
You say in your book, eco or eco fascists today descend from decades of nativist environmentalism, yet um, we tend to think of environmentalism as a liberal or left phenomena. Why? Richard Seymour in The Disenchanted Earth noticed two significant reasons. First, since the 70s, the environmental movement turned its gaze to global warming and away from local conservation of land. Quote, you're quoting in your book, in one form of eco-fascist idiom, what one conserves is the habitat of the ethos, end quote. Seymour explained, quote, the land from that point of view is where nature and culture meet in a form of life that must be protected from the, quote, invader, species, and people. Second, the left, winning control of the movement, pushed aside the right and allowed resentment to fester out of sight. And then you go on and you talk about Earth First founder Dave Foreman and so forth. But talk about this phenomena of it suddenly becoming a left wing issue, which makes it part of our culture war. And now
Mhm.
resentment festers out of sight, which adds a further dimension to this. So we've got the Christian Zionists involved. We have this kind of insanity of the Middle East becoming a hotspot. Only we pretend it's for other reasons, but it's really about the oil. And then you add in this fact that within our own environment in the United States, certainly, belief or denial of climate science is now a culture war phenomena as well. And the resentment festers, as you put it. So I think that's a really big point in your book, and I'd just like you to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So in the 70s, as you mentioned, as I discussed in my final chapter, it was common to have ethno-nationalists working in environmental circles. This makes a certain amount of logic from a sort of fascist perspective, right? Fascism is blood and soil. And if you're talking about soil, you're talking about the land that needs to be defended from the outsider, right? If we shift from talking about environmentalism to specifically talking about what's up in the air, the
Mm-hmm.
climate, right? Then it becomes less fertile ground for ethno-nationalists to care about, right? So there were these, famous purges in the Sierra Club, for example, had
Sure.
Tanton, he is doing this kind of big push around ethno-nationalism and so forth. And the Sierra Club, to their credit, they've acknowledged this history and worked to kind of make amends for what happened, right? But today, climate change is specifically coded as a right-wing phenomenon. Again, I want to say climate change is coded as a left-wing or
Left wing
liberal
phenomena.
phenomenon.
Yeah.
If it becomes a right-wing phenomenon again, which I expect it will be tinged with more of that ethno-nationalism, that anti-migration, right? I
Yeah.
think
So
that's right around the
the right
corner,
wing would
right?
begin to admit climate change, but then say the real problem is people pouring over our borders or making
Right. Yes.
demands.
Yes. If MAGA suddenly, accepts the science, that does not solve our problem, right? In some ways, it will make it worse, right?
Yeah.
And we see this really evident with mass shooter manifestos, right? So I believe it was the El Paso shooter who went into a Walmart and killed a bunch of people. Who released this manifesto that says something to the effect of, we just have too many people,
Hmm.
something has to be done. He talks explicitly about the environmental crisis. And so he's thinking environmental crisis, too many people,
Yeah.
certain types of people need to be put down, right? And it's a very clear logic, right? And I want to say that this is a type of logic that is growing on the right, but the liberal center is not immune from this, right? And
Yeah.
this is what we need to think, because and then, without getting too into it, I always kind of want to clarify when I talk about like political spectrum, the way that political theory works in the academy and in global politics is a little bit different than politics works in the US, right? Because
Sure.
we have a far right party, but we don't have a left wing party. So it becomes conventionally normative to talk about our liberal party as a left party, right? But in
Yeah.
global politics, Democrats would be considered sort of
No,
center
we're
or
not
center
of the left
right,
if
right?
you've ever been to France or
Right.
Germany
Right. So,
or Italy.
right. I mean, the way that sort of the classical perspective, if you find that left-right binary to be helpful, is that there's kind of two parallel axes, two parallel sliders. And one is, do we want to dial up the capitalism, the market relations, the private property rights, or dial them down? And the other is, do we want to dial up hierarchy or dial it back to egalitarian, right? So for the conservative, it's yes to capitalism and yes to racial
Yeah.
misogynist hierarchy, right? If you are a liberal, you're still saying yes to the capitalism, the property rights, right? But you want to dial down the hierarchy and have a little more egalitarian society. But there comes a limit, right? And my
Yeah.
example that I always go to is that a typical liberal is one who really wishes that nobody is denied a job or housing on account of their race or sexual orientation, right? But they
Hmm.
firmly believe that property rights are sacrosanct. That is, if somebody owns the mortgage to a house, they have the right to extract rents from somebody who lives there as their landlord, right?
Hmm.
So a true egalitarianism is not possible in this perspective, because you expect property rights still give you the ability to use other people as surplus exploitation, right? And so from that perspective, I mean, so this is why property rights are so important among people like me on a more left-wing perspective, right? For me as a socialist, I want
Hmm.
to say that as long as we have these sort of market structures that are navigating who deserves to be an owner and who
Yeah.
deserves to, have the means to survive, we are inevitably going to have hierarchies, and those hierarchies are going to get ramped up, right? What this means for like climate and migration is that you might have more liberals saying ha ha ha, a border wall, what a dumb archaic idea. And
Yeah.
then in the very next sentence, what would they say? They would say, instead we need smart borders, right? And
Yeah.
it's particularly that smart border that is terrifying to me, because what kind of
Yeah.
biometrics are you talking about? What kind of surveillance? Are we talking about drones eventually? Maybe not right now, but maybe in 10 more years. But what are we
Sure.
talking about, right? Because these military technologies are designed to kill people and not kill bad guys, right? In
Yeah.
modern combat, in modern, I'll come to a close with this example. I just really want to emphasize this, because we tend to think way too easily in terms of threats and allies, I think, right? But
Hmm.
in modern conflict, 85 to 90% of casualties are civilians, right?
Yeah.
What a military does, like the US military, is mainly kill families, right?
Yeah.
The bulk of that is children, right? And we seem to be okay with that, right?
Hmm.
I have friends in the military or work in a military adjacent industries, right? They don't
Yeah.
think of themselves as family murderers, but that is in fact what is going on the
That's who
bulk
gets
of the
killed.
time when we are engaged in combat, right?
Yeah. And you're talking
And
in your
this is,
book.
yeah, right,
Yeah. To bring it back to your book, you're saying,
yeah,
of
yeah.
course, this is relevant because we're going to be talking about a conflict between the shrinking haves and the growing have-nots based
Hmm.
on climate change and changing ability to feed oneself and grow food, survive the heat, and so forth. I just want to reintroduce you and then dive right back in again. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest is philosopher, religion scholar, and interdisciplinary critical theorist Tad DeLay. And Tad is a philosophy professor, and he's written books that impact me because they're from where I come from. Against: what does the white evangelical want? and other books as well. And now I've been reading a book, and we're talking about Future of Denial, the Ideologies of Climate Change. And I want to dive into something right now off what you were just talking about in terms of economic models, because let's jump right up to the billionaire class here. You have a quote in your book from, I forget where it is. Let's see, maybe page 195 or so. And it's an interesting little story, but there's a lot packed in here. In November 2019, Bolivian President Evo Morales was forced from office in what he called a lithium coup. If wars were fought over oil reserves in the 20th century, expect conflict over lithium in the 21st. When asked whether the US government supported a coup so that Tesla could extract more lithium, Elon Musk boasted, quote, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it," end quote. It was a proud declaration of climate colonialism over Twitter from a man who represents a false hope of decarbonization without sacrificing lifestyles. That's a great line, by the way. A man who represents false hope of decarbonization without sacrificing lifestyles. There's a whole thing in there we need to talk about, but let's continue with the story. Your quote, "If developed states pursue resource-rich lifestyles without sacrifice, leaders will find reasons to treat people who live on top of the minerals as threats. But unlike oil-rich states, which the global north clumsily accuses of terrorism, the villagers of Salar, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this great, Salar de Uyuni, wherever that is, might one day be called enemies of the earth, threatening civilization itself. Such will be those who stand in the way of our lithium," end quote. It's a great passage of the book, but you talk about Elon Musk by name, and of course he represents something even more insidious. But you also talk about this idea of a kind of within the high tech realm of greenwashing, saying, well, AI and electric cars and alternative energy sources will solve the problem, so we don't have to change our lifestyle. And you're saying, come on, that in itself is a form of greenwashing, because if you think we can accomplish all this decarbonization without a change of our lifestyle, you're let alone economic model, you're sort of kidding yourself. I don't know if I'm putting words in your mouth.
No, yeah. Yeah,
So
it's
let's
hard to know.
revisit.
Yes.
My producer Ernie just said, let's revisit false hope of decarbonization without sacrificing lifestyles. That's kind of the big point here, and I'd want to talk about that.
Right. So let's clarify a few terms. So greenwash comes from a student essay in the 80s or 90s, where a student was on a surfing trip in Fiji and went into a hotel to use their bathroom and noticed a sign above the towel saying, do your part to help us keep our environment pure. And this hotel at the same time was undergoing a major expansion that was going to damage the reef and the ocean side. And so he's thinking, I don't think that they really care that much about the environment. They just want to cut cost on washing their towels. And so he comes up with this term greenwash. Sometimes it's called green spin. It's this idea that companies want to portray themselves as more environmentally friendly than they
Well, in your book, you describe how BP does this by changing its color.
BP is the classic example. Yeah, BP kind of took a classic sort of a 10 or 15-year-old metric called an ecological footprint, which is a very big kind of expansive, what are all the different ways that I'm impacting the environment? And they consolidate it to carbon footprint. And I mean, credit to BP. It's probably one of the more effective advertising campaigns ever, because we all know what a carbon footprint is, right? And after they did that campaign, a survey showed that consumers started thinking of BP as a more green oil company when it's the same product, oil and gas, as any other company, right? It doesn't make a difference what company extracts it once you burn it. The physics are the same. So this idea that, can we decarbonize without sacrificing lifestyles? There are these green growth proponents on the one hand, right? And then there's these degrowth proponents on the other, right? And I don't have a huge, I don't tend to side very, very strongly with one or the other. I think the balance of evidence is on the side of degrowth, saying that actually there are certain, that if we want the rest of the world, nearly 1 billion people of which don't have electricity, we want more and more people to have access to the same resources that we have. we're going to need to degrow certain industries that we don't need and make us miserable, right? We don't need all
Yeah.
of the advertising, right?
Yeah.
We don't need private jets, right? But we do need more healthcare, right? We do need more clean energy, right?
Yeah.
And so there are certain places that could scale down while others could scale up. On the other hand, you have, again, the green growth side that kind of says it follows what is in economic literature called an environmental Kuznets curve that says once we kind of grow enough, the damage per unit of GDP will actually kind of level off such that we
Yeah.
can have economic growth and environmental friendliness, right? And so this is a big debate, right? Without getting too into the weeds of it, the question is, is it possible to continue growing our economy
Hmm.
without doing the environmental damage, right? Right now, if we get $1 of GDP, the correlation with fossil fuels is something like, depending on what metric we're talking about exactly, something like 0.93 to 0.98, right? Anytime you have $1 of GDP spent, you have almost as much in fossil fuel, like
Hmm.
it's almost a one-to-one correlation, right? So if the
Yeah.
economy is doing great, greenhouse gas emissions are doing great, right? So can we change that, right? Well, electric vehicles are one hope of changing that relationship, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want to be too negative on this, right? It's very common, I think, on sort of environmental left wing to kind of say that EVs are more damaging than regular cars or just as damaging. That's not quite the case, actually. If after about 5 years or so, even with all the extra mineral inputs, they are more environmentally friendly than
Yeah.
traditional cars, right? It takes a while to kind of get up there. However, in the US, for example, we plug our electric cars into electricity grids, 60% of the energy of which comes from fossil fuels, right? And 20% from coal and 40% from natural gas, right? So, there's also some truth to say that a Tesla, instead of running on oil, runs on coal, right?
Yeah.
So, what's the use there? And then where the greenwash kind of comes out, and this is really what kind of taps into the fantasy of the consumer.
Yeah.
Um, Tesla, its first year being profitable, became profitable by selling lots of carbon credits, right? So it gets all of these free carbon credits so that, and it sells those to companies that are over budget on pollution so that
Which
it
you
can
tie in,
balance
by
out
the
on
way, to
paper.
the BP thing where you're saying they sold carbon credits and for $123 per person or something, we can solve all our problems,
Right.
because
Yeah. 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 So in
that's
in
all
in Tesla's
bullshit.
case, they sold so many carbon credits that you would need to. It was equal to something like 28 or 29 vehicle years per Tesla. Right. So in order to be carbon neutral, that first year Tesla, these markets change fast, so I don't have updated numbers. But the first full
Yeah.
year that Tesla was profitable, you would have needed to drive that car for at least 29 years, plus another five or so to get over the hump that usually EVs
Yeah.
have to drive before they're evened out to 30 plus years before you would
Hmm.
be just at net zero, right?
Yeah.
And that's even before accounting for the fossil fuels and the electricity grid, right? And so from that perspective, it would actually just be better to just drive a normal vehicle, right? And
Yeah.
so we find more and more of these gimmicks that are kind of saying you don't have to sacrifice. And then the companies like Tesla or BP, they're telling you need to sacrifice because they know you won't, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't have the option to, right? Just to live as an American is to live with, several times the carbon footprint on average in the world, right?
Sure.
And we live, we consume 10,000 watts of energy per person, right? Whereas the body's metabolism is 100. So it's essentially, it's as if we're living with 100 energy servants, right? We
Yeah.
live an enormously energy intensive lifestyle. Let me just close with this example. I cite an MIT study that tried to say, what is the limit, right? If you wanted to consume as little as possible to be environmentally friendly, how low could it possibly go? And one of the lifestyles that they examined is a person experiencing homelessness. And they found that even a person experiencing homelessness would still emit more than a third the fossil fuel emissions of a person just living an average American lifestyle.
Hmm.
And so there's a certain limit. There's a certain limit on how much you can do your part, as people
Yeah.
say, right? Because you live in a world that does not give you the option to do your part. If by doing
Yeah.
your part, you mean saving the world.
Yeah. And one thing with the Tesla example and going back to Elon Musk, just to bring it up to full speed right now, is that with his attitude about, well, yeah, if we need a coup, we do it. And he's backing a presidential candidate right now where in their Republican convention they were holding up signs demanding mass deportation now. And these weren't handwritten signs, these were signs being handed out by the party to the faithful, so that you see your book's relevance. You know, the mass deportation is people who've come across the border illegally, being pushed in from an impoverished South, which itself is being impacted by a climate crisis, and so forth and so on. And so we already have a billionaire class that seems to be hardened in terms of whatever greenwashing it needs to do to make a buck, to retreat to its own bunkers when the shit hits the fan. You know, this reads like science fiction, but unfortunately, you know, even in the political climate that we see today, you know, this is what's happening. And then the rest of us are left in the position you've just described of wondering what we can do, and understanding that if we just live and eat and function within this culture, you know, even if we're turning down our thermostats and driving an electric car or whatever it may be, that the entire system is geared towards a denialism, irrespective of our individual opinion. And that brings me to kind of an overall philosophical question. Again, I just want to say that this book is going to be part of our book club here. Future of Denial, The Ideologies of Climate Change is going to be our November book in our November book club. It has to be read. You know, we recommend this book highly. We want you to read it. But it brings me to a question, and that is just yourself as a philosopher, dealing with the realm of ideas and how the human brain works. And you mentioned earlier something that I understand to be true as well, in terms of human evolution is not caught up at all with modernity, let alone anything else. We're still, you know, where we were 2 seconds after we climbed out of a cave someplace. You're writing into that context. Your book is written, you're a human being, you're writing books for other human beings that have not evolved to a place to do any long-term planning. It seems to me, let alone take in the long-term consequences of what you're talking about. How do you as an author, and I'm an author too, I write books for people to read as well. You know, one of the reasons I enjoy writing fiction and make somebody laugh with a novel like Portofino much more than I enjoy writing my nonfiction commentaries is because I have a sense sometimes of not futility, but just hopelessness in thinking, well, I can entertain and I can make somebody laugh. I wonder if I can actually change anybody's mind. And I'm wondering whether you've thought about how your book would be received, and the usefulness or uselessness of just trying to make an argument like you're making while admitting that we're stuck in terms of brain function with an inability, it seems, to deal with these questions, a psychological inability to admit the truth. And I know you must have thought about this, and I know you deal with such questions in your philosophy class, so fire away.
Yeah, I don't have an answer that feels satisfying to me about what you're getting at. What I'll say is a few things. As a philosopher, I think there is value in identifying a problem, right? Even if the solutions are not apparent, right? And I think that there's value in being in the problems arena, even if one is not sufficiently in the solutions arena, right? We have a problem right now, and one of the aspects of that problem is that people believe in American politics, for example, that there's a climate-friendly side and a climate enemy side, right? And actually, what I want to kind of say is that they're tapping into different types of denial, right? This kind of goes back to my thesis around Freud's two denials, right? When the repressed surfaces and you feel a bit of angst, people will typically either deny the reality of what is coming to the surface, or they will accept the reality but deny their moral culpability in various ways, right? And America has a major party for whichever form of climate denial you would like, right? But, you know, what can we do, right? That's always the activist question, right? And I want to say that actually, if your question is how can we stop this crisis, you cannot do that, right? You cannot stop the progress of this storm, which is dictated by what Marx called a law of capitalist accumulation, right? That capitalism can only reward infinite growth, right? And infinite surplus exploitation from labor and the land, right? Okay, so there's a certain amount of limits to what we can do if we are not engaged in policy. However, if you are a student or talking to students in your life, you might seriously ask them to consider giving their lives to this project, because we need all the people that we can developing renewables, working in policy, mitigation and adaptation strategies, and so forth, right? There are significantly important areas in mitigation that we need to tap into, right? But mitigation strategies mitigation is how we bring down the fossil fossil fuels to stop global warming, right?
Yeah.
It's essentially three strategies. We can improve efficiencies. That's an engineering question. We can electrify everything with renewable energy. That's an engineering question. And we can carbon capture whatever we can't capture the other ways, right? Which is an engineering question, right? So those are engineering questions, right? They do have solutions, and we do need to scale up those solutions, right? But if you got your entire city to stop burning fossil fuels, it would be a fraction of a degree on a century timeline, right? I mean, like the scale of this is enormous. However, what I want to tell people also, if we are looking for what you can do, in addition to just identifying the problem, is that there is a whole realm of addressing climate change called adaptation, or sometimes it gets called resilience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And adaptation is a wide open field. It's everything from government policy, like building seawalls or providing more money for fire or flood insurance, and so forth, I mean, I always go to examples like, what do you think will happen in your community when the changes ramp up, right? I live in Baltimore. I live about 15 minutes from the harbor, but I'm about 70 meters above sea level, which is where the seas will come up in a few thousand years, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not worried about sea level, but those 900,000 atomic bombs worth of energy every day going into the hydrological cycle mean more rain, right? Which means more basements or first floors flooding, which means property values decreasing, which means people moving out and banks foreclosing and rent going up, and so forth, which means more foreclosures and addictions. At the same time, the weather's getting hotter, which in
Yeah.
addition to, causing more homicide, causes more domestic violence, which will also trigger more people to be unhoused, right? So a moment ago, we were talking about sea level rise, but I'm actually much more worried about things like food price shocks and energy
Sure.
price shocks and homelessness and addiction. What happens when a sizable part of your community can't eat very well and is turning to fentanyl because they can't buy blueberries anymore, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
so and I don't mean this in terms of scaring people. What I want you to think is there are things that you can do, right? You might have expertise, legal expertise, or public relations expertise that can plug into climate, work around you. You might have work that you can do with local churches to think about housing migrants or people displaced, right? We need to get
Yeah.
much, much better at seeing the effects of climate change that will not look like climate change, right?
Yeah.
Addiction does not look like climate change, but addiction is going to be a big factor in how communities respond to the types of
Mm.
turmoil on the horizon and that are already happening, right? We are already seeing it again, right?
Yeah.
So if anybody, has questions, I have a whole big list of actually adaptation strategies that
I
I'd like
like
to
the
share
adaptation
around.
strategy.
Right. Yeah.
Just that
Um,
word adaptation strategy is a very good way to think of it.
right. Which doesn't mean giving in to this, right? But kind of means if there are going to be changes on the horizon, we need to save as many of us as possible, and then that's going to require work from everybody. And on the adaptation side, there are things that just about anybody can do.
Yeah, and also just this idea of young people diving in. It happens. I have a grown-up grandson whose wedding I officiated at last summer in France. He married a French young woman he met in university, and he studied agriculture, and now he is managing three regenerative farms, which are taking land that has been misused, and in terms of adaptation strategy, bringing it back by the kind of trees and nut bushes they're planting, by regenerating the soil, by composting, by putting certain types of animals to range and roam free on the land to reestablish a balance with the ecosystem. So there are lots of younger people hopefully jumping in to projects like you're talking about. Let me just talk about something here. I want to quote from your book again, where you write, for nearly a century, GDP, gross domestic product or production, has been the ultimate measure of, quote, growth in the economy, which is more or less reflexively treated as an object that exists. In theological terms, our economy works like a theodicy, an explanation for why some go hungry while others fail. This economy, like God, distributes resources according to a rubric of blame or deservingness, thinking of Musk again, because that's his philosophy. The more one's work contributes to the GDP, the more righteous it must be, regardless of use value to humans. That dovetails so nicely with what we were talking about with Musk and that kind of view of the world. But also just I like the way in your book you have this interplay of your background with theology and this issue, because these two are belief systems. and they
Mhm.
impact the way people talk about this. So, um, I'd like you to
Absolutely.
go
Yeah.
into that a little bit, and then also just what my producer Ernie Gregg texted me, which is really good, and that is, what's the most important thing we can say to our political party to signal that we admit that climate change is real? And that would be a kind of good place to wrap things up. If you want to dive into any of that and talk about it as we wrap it up, and then just mention again your book will be in our book club.
Yes, absolutely. Well, yeah, maybe we can just kind of close with this. Yeah, economy as a type of theodicy, right?
Yeah,
Theodicy is a theological term that means what more than anything, it's an explanation for why people deserve to suffer.
yeah,
Job is the classic example of this, right? Job has these troubles befall him, and his friends come and give him essentially three explanations. God is punishing you, or
yeah.
God is not punishing you, but he's giving you an opportunity to better yourself and prove yourself.
Mhm.
Or other people have it worse. Stop complaining, right? And these are the three responses that we get when something horrific happens interpersonally, or when we lose our job. Is it because you deserve it, or are you struggling because you have an opportunity to go back to school and learn something, or
Yeah,
you don't complain. You're above poverty line in the U.S. You're in the top 10% globally, right? So what right have you to complain, right? And when we think of climate change, the people who are going to suffer the most in the global south are the people who caused it the least, right? And
yeah,
when they
yeah.
move, they will be looked at and said, "You're not going through the border in the correct way, right?
Mhm.
Therefore, you are not a human, right? You do not, you grew up in the wrong place, so you do not deserve to eat." And if you don't check the right paperwork, you deserve to die, right?
Well, and if
And
you have a
this
party
is
running on the platform of mass deportation of millions, which sounds like it's torn right out of a page from Nazi Germany, not to be too put too fine a point on it, and you've got a reclassification of people coming over your southern border as subhuman, the next step is the armed drones that just take them out at the border. We're going to become a very inhuman place if we follow this logic.
Yes, yeah, yeah, but at the risk of perhaps alienating myself from your audience, I want to also say that this logic is part of the Liberal Party as well, right? It's not on the surface in the same way, certainly, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
did Obama deport more people than Trump, right? Has
Mm,
has Biden continued the Title 42 policies of Trump,
yeah.
right? Has anybody dismantled the migrant camps? This is still on the horizon, right? And in
And just let
terms
me
of
let me dive in
yeah,
there because
right.
I think
So
it's a good point. Why is that? Why can you have this liberal sensibility on the surface and then underneath, um, when it comes to policy, whether it's dealing with the Saudis and or or the Middle East or our policy towards the migrant community and so forth. Why is it that the overriding GDP driven formula of the left and the right means that when you dig beneath the surface, there's not a policy difference when it comes to this, or has not been.
right, yeah, well, because they're not socialists, right? I mean, because they agree on the fundamental importance of capitalist relations and property relations, which override the sensibilities about
Mm-hmm.
human rights and dignity and equality, right?
Yeah,
The way I often think about this is this comes from a theorist called Matt Christman, but he said something to the effect of if if you admit that the barbarism has to happen, the domination, right? We can't have an egalitarian, non-capitalist future, right? That all of that is here to stay. If that is what you kind of accept as your political priors, right? Which I
yeah,
don't, right? But if that is, then you have a choice of looking at that barbarism and dominance and feeling good about it, and that's what a
yeah,
conservative is, or looking at that barbarism and feeling bad about it, and that is what a liberal is, right? But if the prior commitment is that no, property rights are sacrosanct, socialism is off the table,
yeah,
egalitarianism can only be tinkered with in the margins by kind of
yeah,
changing the ratios of how many people of this demographic or that demographic are sitting on the board of Raytheon before they kill
yeah,
somebody, right? If that's kind of your priors and that's the scope of your political horizon, then that dominance and barbarism is there to stay. It
yeah,
just has to get talked about differently, right? So the classic example that I've seen kind of circulating in the last day is the DNC. It kind of ramps up is that it begins with a land acknowledgement that we are on land
right,
that was taken in a genocide from Native peoples, right?
yeah,
From indigenous peoples. And, but then 90 pages later, it's, Israel has a right to do this, what they're doing in Gaza, right?
sure.
Which is, to annihilate indigenous peoples, right?
Yeah, so you
Uh,
feel
and,
bad
and
about
so,
it,
and
but
so, yeah.
basically you
So
don't you don't change anything, and it's just, hey, this is the way things are.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's something like that, right? And I do think that there's something that we need to think about in terms of just the human. I mean, this is the psychoanalyst coming in me, so I won't go into this too deep. But human enjoyment is irrational, and it doesn't work the way that people want it to work. And a
Right.
lot of the drive of enjoyment comes from deeply disturbing impulses to destroy ourselves masochistically or to destroy others sadistically.
Mm.
Human beings like killing other people, like dominating other people, like making other people feel uncomfortable. And so when I critique liberals, I'm genuinely glad that there's so many people who are like have some empathy and want to care for others, right? But
Mm.
my point is that it must go much further in terms of material relations, right? We must make much more clear demands to say things like, changing certain sort of surface level features of
Mm.
egalitarianism without actually having a sort of deep egalitarianism, a commitment that everybody deserves healthcare, everybody deserves living wages, everybody deserves housing. Without those types of demands, we're just kind of tinkering with the surface level changes in sort of an ornamental fashion.
Yeah, well, I would like to dive into a sort of a deeper philosophical discussion, and maybe we can get to that when your book is part of our book club. We'll revisit this
You would
and
love to, yeah, yeah.
try to talk about the question of, the recognition that evolution is a very, 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 very slow process, and we're at the beginning of human evolution, and yet your book and what you're just saying sort of makes demands that in one way you could say jumps to a position, whether it's 100 or 1,000 years from now, when maybe there's a different level of human evolution and consciousness, but at the same time, we have a responsibility to do more than acknowledge that we took somebody's land, feel sorry about it, move on and do exactly the same thing again.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
quandary.
yeah. At the end of the day, I always like to point out that, all of our extant philosophies and religious systems
Yeah.
evolved after writing, after writing was pioneered at Uruk to make it easier to dominate classes of people who were slaves,
Yeah,
doing
and tell
surplus
our own
labor for the
story about it.
exploiters, right?
God called us to do this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But all of our stories were written after that class divide, right? All of
Yeah,
our values in the world over, with the exception of some indigenous traditions,
yeah,
come after writing, after the split into classes where some people deserve to be dominated and other people deserve to live easy, because they were industrious, right? Which really just means their great ancestors, killed somebody else, right?
yeah. And somehow God favors, it must be because the gods or God favors this person or this class of people, and this is the way it's supposed to be.
Hmm, hmm, hmm.
Yeah. So let me just wrap this up by saying this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is philosopher and religion scholar Tad DeLay. And Tad has written a number of very interesting and provocative books. And the one we're talking about right now is Future of Denial, the Ideologies of Climate Change. We're going to make it an offering, and it has to be read in November. And maybe we can get you back, Tad. And I have a
Would love
favor
to.
to ask you. Please don't ring off, as it were, when I say thank you and jump out of here. Stay a minute and give my producer, Ernie, first of all, links to anything you want to have linked to, so we can put that with wherever we put this and promote the book for you and what you're doing. And then the second thing is, if you have other guests, whether they're writers or people you quote, I was going to say living or dead, but stick with the living, that you want to recommend as a guest, please do that, because sometimes our best guests come to us because they're people we haven't thought of that someone else recommends. So
Okay,
if you
okay.
if you want to give Ernie a couple ideas on people we want to talk to in or out of your field, doesn't matter, anyone you find interesting,
Hmm.
that would be great. So
Hmm.
any final words you want to leave us with, other than buy the book and read it and change the way you're living, or um,
If people buy directly from the publisher, Verso Books, if you use the promo code denial at checkout, it gives you an additional 20 or 30%
I
off.
like
So,
that. And we will
uh,
we will have a way to click on that from our book as our page as well.
yes, and I
And
and I
so,
hope people go and read the article that I just published that I mentioned at Parapraxis magazine. You can find this online free. The title is Evangelical Zionism.
well,
That's
Ernie,
my
maybe
most
we
recent
can.
publication.
Ernie, how about you promote that too? I'm speaking to my producer. He'll find that link and put it up everywhere, and we'll stick it up somewhere. And Ernie's saying, "New message to me. I'll post and promote!" Exclamation point. So
Wonderful.
done,
All right.
done deal.
Thank you.
So listen, thank you so much. It's been really great, Tad, and we'll talk again. And thank you for writing the book. There was a lot of work in that book, and you
Thank you
did a
for
good.
inviting me on and interacting. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
no, no, you did a terrific. It's a
All
great
right.
service you've done, and I thank you for it.
Okay. Well, thank you very
Talk later.
much.
Okay, bye bye.